Okay, so I've got RubyMine up and going, and my Vagrant machine is already up and running, and I'm already SSH'd into my Vagrant box. And I'll navigate to my Vagrant shared folder. Up to this point, we've been working in a Ruby subfolder of the Vagrant shared folder, and I'm now going to start working in this Rails subfolder. You may not have one yet, and so you can create one if you navigate to your Vagrant folder and then do an make dir Rails. That'll make that directory. And remember that this Vagrant folder is a shared folder, so we could also make the directory from Windows, right? So if I hit like Windows E and I went to my C Vagrant Rails, I could make the same Rails folder from the Windows side of things by just hitting new folder. So either way is fine. I don't have to run that command because I already have it, so I will navigate to the Rails folder. If one thing is after you updated Ruby, your Ruby on your machine, you may not have reinstalled the Rails gem. So at this point, you might have to do a gem install Rails. If you run it and you've already got Rails on your system, it doesn't hurt anything. It'll just tell you that you've already got that gem. And so mine's already installed, and that's fine. So Rails is a few things. Rails is a MVC framework, of course, for creating web applications. It's a curated set of gems. So if you hadn't already installed Rails, you'd be seeing it now downloading a whole bunch of different gems that are sort of associated with the Rails framework. It's also a command line tool that gets installed when you install the gem. So part of that now is I should be able to, oh no, I don't need Slack, thank you. I should be able to run the Rails command -v to see a version number, and we should likely be all at the same version. Yeah?
My Vagrant isn't listing any files in the Vagrant directory, and I can't create a new directory.
Oh, are you sure you're in /vagrant?
Yeah, it says the exact same thing as where you did CD Rails. Yeah, that's fine.
The shared folder might have somehow gotten disconnected from Windows, so we'll probably have to debug that after class. So you might want to just watch along. So I have this Rails command here, and I'm going to pass it the new parameter, which means I want to create a new Rails application. If we had Ruby and Rails installed locally, we could actually do this directly from RubyMine. And so there's a process in RubyMine when we say like new application, we pick Rails. If we were developing Rails locally, we would just say, make this Rails app for me. Because we're doing sort of that remote SDK option, we have to build the Rails app ourselves through Commander, and then we can go to RubyMine for everything else. The example that I'm building today is Harry Potter themed, and so Harry Potter is going to be the name of my Rails application. And there's a bunch of other switches that I could use along with this Rails new, like specifying which database adapter that I want to use, but for this example, I'm going to use the default database adapter, which is SQLite, the file-based database adapter. So later on in the course, I'll show you how to have it set up with Postgres as its database adapter. All of our Vagrant boxes have Postgres already pre-installed, so we could use that as well. So I can just hit enter here. And it does a few things. Mine's probably going to go a lot faster than yours because I've ran it recently, and you may not have. But some of the things it did was you can see all these create statements. That is the Rails command creating a whole file folder structure for you for this new project. So it's going to create a Harry Potter directory, and in it, it's going to put a README file and this rake file and a gem file and all of these other subfolders and files. And so every Rails application has the same file folder structure. So if you know Rails and you come to a Rails project that you haven't seen before, you sort of will know the lay of the land. But as new Rails programmers, you have to sort of learn that file folder structure, and I'll be teaching you some of that. And then the other thing that happens after all those things are created is it runs bundle install from within that folder. And if we saw up here, one of the things that was added was a gem file that lists all the gems that a Rails project depends upon. And so here is bundle pulling in all those dependent gems. 70 gems now installed. So the gem file had 16 dependencies, but some of those dependencies had dependencies, and some of those dependencies probably also had sub-dependencies. So at the end of the day, you are relying on 70 different gems. This makes some people uncomfortable, right? That's like a whole bunch of code that we as programmers didn't write ourselves. It's all open source code. There's some security implications. Like, I'm not likely going to go and read the source code of all those dependent gems. But there could be sort of a bad actor out there that creates gems that are helpful but that contain backdoors that we then end up pulling into our applications. Something to think about. I'm now going to navigate to my Harry Potter folder. I'm also going to, at this point, open the folder up as a new project in RubyMine. And so I've got RubyMine on this sort of open screen. I'm going to click the open option. And I'm going to navigate to that folder, which is Vagrant Rails, a Rails subfolder, Harry Potter, OK. So a few things have happened, one of which is that RubyMine has detected that some of the gems are not installed. This is one aspect of using RubyMine that I don't fully understand yet. Like, Bundler on the commander side of things has just installed all the gems that we need. And yet when we come over here, it tells me that I need to install them. So I have to do that. I click this install button. I don't need to give any extra arguments, and I don't need to run with any extra privileges, so I can just hit install. And no, I don't want to add anything to Git right now. If that little message didn't pop up automatically for you, you can also make it pop up by going to Tools, and then Bundler, and then Install. So that's Tools, Bundler, Install, if you didn't get that little pop-up. So it's at this point that, and I didn't do this with the other section, but I believe we can leave Commander behind and use the embedded terminal within RubyMine to do the rest of our work. Not really a requirement, but it might just be nice to have the terminal within our IDE. So we can open up an SSH terminal within the IDE by going to Tools and Start SSH session and picking Vagrant. This is only going to work if you followed the steps of that sort of RubyMine tutorial that I posted, where one of the aspects of it was sort of telling RubyMine where Vagrant was set up. So if this doesn't work for you right now, we can work it out later, and you can just continue to use Commander until then. So I click that. And it usually takes a little bit of time. It's opened up a terminal for me, and it shows local, which I don't need, but it also shows the loopback address 127.0.0.1. That's my Vagrant box. And so I can do an ls, I can navigate to my Vagrant Rails Harry Potter folder, and we're good. RubyMine has a bunch of capabilities for dealing with version control. I tend to just do all my version control from the command line here, so I might, I might end up using this as a way of like interacting with Git. I won't do that today, but that's one of the things I might do. Let's take a quick look at the folder structure of a Rails application. There are a few folders that we're going to spend a lot of time with this term, and they are the app folder. This is where you have subfolders for your MVC stuff, your models, your views, and your controllers, amongst other things. Another folder that we'll spend some time with is the config folder. Specifically, anytime we need to sort of reassign database credentials, we'll be working with this database.yml. And as we're adding new routes, so URIs that route to various controller actions, we'll be working with that routing file. Another folder that we'll spend some time with is going to be the DB folder. That's where our database is going to live for our application, specifically for our applications that use SQLite 3 for their database. And it's also going to be where we can take a look at how Rails is managing our database schema and other things, so sort of DB related things. Those are our main folders that we're going to end up working with. The log folder can also be helpful. As the Rails web server runs, this development.log file is something that we can test or use or check for error messages or debug logging, etc. Today we're going to spend most of our time though in the DB folder, because most of what we're going to do is going to be database specific. We're also going to spend a little bit of time in that models folder because we're going to create some models. So what I want to do to begin with is, we've seen in a past class how to interact with Active Record outside of Rails. I'm now going to create a model and an associated database table within Rails. So when we worked with Active Record outside of Rails, I gave you the database with the tables pre-existing. And we haven't done that here. There's no pre-existing tables, and so I have to go about creating them. And I do so by way of creating the model, and then the model in turn creates something called a migration. And the migration is a description in Ruby of changes that need to be made to the database, and then we run that migration to bring those changes into effect. Eventually, as I teach you some of these commands, you might prefer to run them by way of RubyMine itself. And so under Tools, there is this option for Rails generators. For now, you're going to see me just run all the generators at the command line. Eventually, you might just want to use Control-G to run them from the IDE, but I think it's helpful to see them running from the command line to begin with. So again, make sure that you've navigated to that Harry Potter folder, or else these commands won't work. And the first command we're going to do is we're going to create a model. So I'm going to say Rails, it's just the Rails command, G, which stands for generate, and we could, if we wanted to, spell out the whole word generate, but G works. And I want to generate what? A model. So there's generators for models, there's also generators for controllers. And specifically, I'm going to create a student model. And my student is going to have a name, which is a string. So name : string, and then a space. And I will give this student a student _ number, : and I'll make that a string as well. And so it sort of went across lines here, but that's student _ number. And then I will also give the student a GPA, which will be a decimal. And at that point, I can hit enter. And you can see the two main files that were created is in the db migrate folder, we got this a long timestamp create students, and in the app models folder, we got a student.rb. So if I look in those folders, I can open those files up, db migrate, open up that file, and app models, open up that file. The student.rb class is just a class named student, just what we asked for, inheriting from application record. Application record sits right in that same folder, and it itself inherits from active record base. So in our last work with active record, we had our students, we had our models directly inherit from active record base. In Rails, we have them inherit from application record. That way, if we have any functionality that we want all of our models to share, we have a place to put it. We can put shared code in application record that gets shared across all of our models, and then all of those models in turn inherit from active record base. So it's a little bit of an object hierarchy or a class hierarchy. And so this is where we could go about like adding validations. So I could add like validates, let's say like name and student number. Sorry, this should be colon name and colon student number, presence true. So that's just defining, if we're going to go create student objects and try to persist them to the database, that persistence is only going to work if we have supplied a non-blank name and a non-blank student number. Our database table doesn't yet exist, the students table, but we do have this migration. Class create students, inherits from active record migration. It contains a single method called change that includes a create table statement for students, and then it says t string name, t string student, t string decimal GPA, and timestamps. And so what that's doing is just describing, in terms of Ruby, the database table that we're about to create. So we're about to create a table named students. It's going to have a column called name. That's going to end up being of type varchar 255 in the database. We're going to have a column called student number, also a varchar. GPA, which will be decimal type, some kind of floating point type. Timestamp, these are the created at and updated at timestamps that come with all Rails database tables. And then the other column that isn't mentioned here, there will be an ID, which will be the auto-incrementing primary key. So every table in Rails always has an ID column, which is the auto-incrementing primary key. So the question is, how do I turn this Ruby source code into an actual database table named students? Well, I have to run the migration. So I created the migration from the command line. I can also run the migration from the command line, and I do that by saying Rails space db : migrate. And again, that's something that we could also do directly from RubyMine. So in RubyMine, we could do that by way of tools and under the run rake tasks, but we're just going to do it right here. Rails db : migrate. That goes to this migration folder and runs any outstanding migrations. So any change we make to the database, we make by way of a migration. And you're going to see later on today, I'm going to alter a table to add a new column by way of a migration as well. So there's always this process. We don't directly add the new column. First we add the migration, then we run it to add the column. The really nice thing about having migrations is those migrations exist with your source code in your version control. So you also have like this snapshot of your database over time. So if you ever needed to roll back to an old version of your source code by way of version control, you can actually also roll back your database to any point in time as well. So it's a very powerful way of managing changes to your database. It also is a way of sharing changes to a database across a team. So if I was working on this project with a whole bunch of team members and I added a new table or I changed a column in a table, all that would have to happen is I would check in my new migration into the the Git repository. My team members would pull that down to their local servers or their local machines, and they would just run the migrations, and we would all have our databases in sync. So it's a really good tool for keeping databases in sync across teams as well. Okay, so I now have a students table and I have a student model. That means I should be able to create student records within this table, and I can do that by going to Tools and running a Rails console. And it asks me the development environment, and I want the development environment. What the Rails console is it's a version of IRB, that interactive Ruby prompt that you've seen me use, but one where all of Rails's gems are loaded so that we can work with the project in and of itself. So I have access to my student here. I can say student.new and get back an empty student object. Or I could say student.create and provide like a name and a student number and a GPA for this student. I'll show you that create statement again. There it is right there. And you can see it's got the debug logging on, so we actually get to see the SQL that was generated when I ran that create statement. And we get to see the returned object that was created. You can see that returned object has its primary key set to 1. The GPA is there. It looks a little bit funny because it's written in scientific notation. So it's 0.32 times 10 to the power of 1. And then you can see the created at and updated at timestamps are there as well. And so now I could go to student.count, and it should tell me that I have 1 student after doing a select count star. I could also test to see if my validations worked, right? So I could go and do a student.create and provide just a name, leaving out the student number. I have to spell create correctly. That's critical. It began the transaction, immediately rolled it back. My object exists, but I would not have gained a student in my database. I still have just 1 because I tried to create an invalid student. So all of that stuff is working. Most or everything we're going to be doing today is focusing just on the back end of Rails. So we're not yet going to worry about how Rails is going to work as a web application, how it's going to take in URIs and map them to controller actions and display HTML views. But we do want to look at some of the stuff you're going to have to do for your project as far as setup, is that once you have a model and an associated table, you're going to want to start generating some data. And so Rails has a process for that. Any data that you want to have initially present in your application, you can put into a script that can be run when the application is pulled down from version control, or when it's deployed to a new server. And that's the seed script. I'm going to go to the seed script, and it says this file should contain all the record creation needed to seed the database with its default values. And it gives us some examples. I'm going to delete some of them, and what I'm going to do, it's at the very top of this script, I'm going to do a destroy all on student, just so that every time I run this seed script, I'm going to go to sort of a clean slate and bring in the data again. And then in here, here I could have, create statements. I have, student.create, and again I could run that same polyglutton, student number, GPA, and I could have a put statement here. And then in order to run that, I want to go back down here to my terminal. That's my little SSH terminal. And I'm going to run that seed script from the terminal. And again, we could probably, I haven't tried this out, but we could probably run that from the rake task command. Here I'm going to run it as, before I ran Rails DB migrate, now I'm going to run Rails DB seed. And that just runs that seed script, bringing in the entire, we can't just run it as a Ruby file because then we wouldn't have all of the Rails environment loaded up. But if we do Rails DB seed, it'll load up our Rails environment and then run that script within that context. And I should see my grammatically incorrect put statement, seed script generated 1 students. Maybe I'll put a period there. Before I proceed, is there any questions or comments about anything I've done up to this point? So what I'd like to do is create a bunch of students, and I would like them to have sort of unique names and unique student numbers and GPAs and all that. I'm not going to pull it in from an API, although that might be what you do in your project. I am going to use that faker gem. And so you had some experience with that on a challenge. The first step of using that faker gem is going to be adding it to the project's gem file. So I'm going to go to that gem file. You can see in this gem file, the Rails gem is there, and the SQLite 3 gem is there, and Puma, the built-in web server, is there. I'm going to scroll down. There's also some sections at the bottom for grouping, so like gems that will only be used during development and test mode, or in development mode only. Typically, I put my custom gems sort of above those grouped gems. I can delete these ones here. They're all just comments. And so I'm going to just say gem, faker. That's it. In the gem file, yeah, in gem file. Not in gem file lock, just in gem file. And I put mine on line 29, gem faker. At that point, RubyMine might pop up saying you need to install this gem. It might detect that, or it might not. If it doesn't, you can go to Tools, Bundler, Install, and just run Bundler to ensure that it pulls in all the appropriate gems that you need, including the new one that we just added. And so I should now be able to interact with Faker. Rails console. If I head over to the Rails console and hit reload, that likely means I can access Faker. Let me see if that's true. Faker, Harry Potter, .name. Maybe I have to restart the console for it to be aware of it. Well, I'll try to just directly do it within here. I'll do faker : Harry Potter dot unique dot name. I'll go back to my terminal and I will run my db seed script. It looks like I generated one student. And then my console, student.first. That's exactly not what I wanted. It actually literally put the words Faker Harry Potter in there. Funny. So why would that be? I see Faker in my list. I do. In my terminal, just let me do some debugging here. So in my terminal, I'm going to run a separate Rails console and see if I have access to Faker. Oh, that's because it's not name. It's character. RTFM, right? Dot character. And if I chain unique on that, it should make a unique character. So, okay. I exit out of my debugging console and I run my db seed script again. And then I go back over here to my console that's up and running, Rails console, and I try student.first again, and that's what I wanted to see. Okay, if I hit Alt-1, I can collapse that project to give me a little bit more coding space. Let's say I wanted 10 students. I can do a 10 times do with an end on it. And then for each student, I will create a unique character. For each student number, I will use Faker Bitcoin to create an address, just to give them some kind of fake data for their student number. And then, what did I do for this one? I'll look that up. I used like some kind of numeric thing. Numeric. No? GPA is going to be faker number dot normal. So it's going to be like, pick a number that has a normal distribution around a mean of 25 with a standard deviation of 25. So that'll pick a number, you know, from 50 up to 100 with a standard deviation, but then I want it to be a GPA, so I will multiply that number by 4 and divide it by 100, and then I'll round it to 1 decimal place. And so that should give me a sort of a nice generic GPA. And sometimes when I'm working with create statements where I've sort of broken them up on multiple lines with all of the keys lining up over here, I sometimes also like to line the values up as well. I can show you what's happening on the far side there. So I'll come back to this code in a second. Let's just make sure it actually works, that it runs, that it creates 10 students, that it creates correct fake data for them. So I'll go back to my terminal and I'll rerun my seed script. Yeah, looks like I got to debug something. So now it's like the fine art of reading a Ruby stack trace. So typically, when you look at a Ruby stack trace, there's going to be a whole bunch of files that you have no command over, right? You did not write or run any of these files. So we need to look for the dbseed file, like where that is. And it's like, oh, you've got method missing on lines 9 and 6. What's my method missing? Oh, it's yeah, number normal. Faker number normal.
The faker, I need to install the faker. Run install could not find the faker in random gen start listed.
I'll have to take a look at that with you separately to see why that is. And then I have to also see why mine is not working either. Do I have non-match? I do, yeah. Thank you. Yeah, that should fix it. Or not.
There's a squiggly beside the round colon 1. I think you're missing a bracket there.
Oh, yeah. Well, how many brackets do I have here? That one there, and that one there, and that one there, and the squiggly means expected. It's still expecting a bracket. Oh, it's expecting the very last bracket for the create statement. Thank you. Yeah, this bracket. There we are. That seems to have worked. I can go back to my console, and if I look at the first student, you can see there's a student. They have a Bitcoin wallet address for their student number, and their GPA is 2.7. And if I do like student.last instead to get a different student, there's a different student with a different student number and a GPA of 2.1. And they have their created at and updated at timestamps as well. Yeah.
Is there a student.random or something like that?
Is there a student.random? Oh, like defined a random student? Yeah, there's student.sample, I think. Student.all.sample. Yeah. So I can sample students in that way. I don't know about the efficiency of that. It might be finding all of them and then like returning one to you. So if your database was really big, that might not be the best thing to do. You could also probably do student order. I don't know if SQLite supports the random function.
I think it does, because we did that in the last.
And did it work? Yeah. So that this is likely more efficient. So there you go. Student ordered random limit 1 first will give you a random student in maybe a slightly more efficient way than the all sample. Okay, why don't we take a 10-minute break, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to create an associated table so that there's going to be a one-to-many association between students and houses. So we're now creating students. I just want to give an example of a few things. I want to give an example of an associated model. So I want to set up a one-to-many association, and in doing so I'm going to have to do another model creation, and then to get the association wired up I'm going to have to do a migration to add a column, because I'm going to need a foreign key. So anytime we have a one-to-many, we're going to need a foreign key in one of our tables. And so I'm going to run a migration to set that foreign key in action. So let's see what I want to do. So yeah, I want students to belong to houses, and so I want a house model. If anyone has not read or watched Harry Potter, they're at a school where there's a bunch of houses, and the students belong to those houses. Has everyone seen or watched Harry Potter? There was one person in the other class, so it felt like I needed to explain. Okay, I will do just that. So I'm going to generate that new model. Let's try doing it by way of the generator here. So I'll do run Rails generator. The generator I want to run is the model generator. And then the model name is house, and in this case I'm going to keep things really simple, and I'm just going to give the house a name : string. So simply in the generator arguments, capital H house space name : string. The environment is development. I don't know what that check mark means, but I'm going to leave it in there. And I'm going to click OK. Looks like it created a house class for me. That's good. I can put a validation in there. Validates name, presence, true. So a house needs to have a valid name in order to be saved. And then this is also where I would wire up my associations, right? I need to wire up both sides of my associations within both the student and the house model. In the house model, this is the one of the one-to-many. So a house has many : students. What this will give me the ability to do is I will be able to pull up a house row from my houses table and do .students on it to see all the students that belong to that particular house. On the other side of the association, so this means that each house can have many associated students rows. On the other side of the association, we have the student. This is the many. And a student belongs to a house, singular. So again, like a lot of things in Rails, the pluralization and the singularization of things is important. We belong to a single house, so we write house singular. A house has many students, it has multiple students, so we have students plural. So typically if you say the thing out loud and it sounds grammatically correct, you've got it right. So house has many students, and student belongs to a house. And what this means, that the student belongs to a house, this means there is a house ID foreign key in the students table. And there actually really isn't yet. We have to make one. But that's what this association here is going to depend upon a house ID. This is a convention. It's just the name of the association underscore ID is going to be the name of our foreign key. And so now I need to create a migration for that to actually happen, for that to actually be added to the students table. I always forget how to word this migration perfectly, so I'm going to go to the Ruby on Rails guides, guides.rubyonrails.org, and we have a migrations guide. And I know within this guide there is an example for adding references to tables, which is what they call foreign keys. References. So this is an example where they're adding a user ID foreign key to a products table. And so they've worded it Rails generate migration add user ref to products space user references. I'm going to word mine similarly. It's going to be Rails G, because I'm not going to spell migration all the way, migration. And then in camel case, I'm going to say add house ref to students, house references. And so over at my terminal, that's what I'll do, Rails G migration, add house ref to students, plural, house references. Anytime you want to add a column, regardless of what data type it is, you can always do add column name to the table you want to add to, and then you repeat the column name and its data type afterwards. So Rails calls foreign keys references. And so add Rails G migration, add house ref to students, house references, that looks good. And so I'll run that. I now have 2 outstanding migrations in the DB migrate folder. There's one outstanding migration that was created when I created the house model, and I just created a new migration as well. We can see those, like I can go over to DB and migrate, and I can see both of those. So here's the create house migration, which is going to be a create table statement for a houses table with a name column, timestamps, and of course the ID is going to be there as well. And then this one here, add reference to the students table for the house, and yes, it's a foreign key. So I want to run those, and I run them from the terminal. Rails DB migrate will run both of the outstanding migrations. No errors. I get to see that everything seems to have worked correctly. Good. Anytime if I forget what my database looks like, I can look in this schema file, schema.rb. Also notice that if I try to run this migration again, it doesn't rerun the migrations, it's just going to do nothing because it keeps track, the schema file keeps track of which migration we're currently at. So if I open up the schema file, the version is set to the timestamp of the last migration that ran. And so that's why it knows when to or when not to run migrations. And then within this file, this is a file you should never manually alter. You can't just go and change things in here and expect it to update in your database. This is a generated file that Rails regenerates every time you run a migration. This file also can be used to sort of bring your whole schema into existence. So if you've been working on a Rails project over a number of years and you bring a new dev into your team, they download the repository, they could run Rails DB migrate, but there might be hundreds of migrations sitting there, some adding tables, removing tables, adding columns, blah, blah, blah. They can also just do Rails DB, and I think it's like schema, or there's a DB command that will just go to the schema file and just create the table in its, or all the tables in their current form without having to run through all the migrations. So you can see here, students, it has a house ID integer column and an index on that column as well. That's going to be our foreign key. What that means is we can now add houses and associated students. So if I go back to my seed script here, I'm going to create 5 houses. There were only 4 houses in the Harry Potter world, but this faker seems to be able to create more than that, so I'll create one more. I'm going to create a new house variable, and I'm going to say house.create faker : Harry Potter unique house. And then instead of creating my student directly, I'm going to make a new student. Let's see the best way of doing it. Maybe new house. Let's see. I'll use my new house dot students dot build, and then I'll pass the same data to it. And build. Do I get a create here? Because build's going to create but not save. I guess I could create a student variable and then save it. There might be a students.create. We can try that out as well. Let me just try to run this, and then I'll come back to it. I'll also put here seed script generated host.count houses. So when this runs, we should see that the seed script has generated 5 houses and 50 students, right? 10 students for each house. So let me run this to make sure it didn't break. Let me see. This will be Rails DB seed. It did break. And where do I got my problems? Oh, name. I have to specify what I actually want the house name to be, which attribute it should be used for. So it's the name attribute of a house. Five houses, 50 students. Just so I can run this seed script multiple times, I will also put a house.destroy all at the beginning of it, so that we could run it again now, and it would first flush both tables and then regenerate the 5 houses and the 50 students. There we are. Yeah.
So is the order of which tables you destroy important? Destroy the choice tree, or you destroy the tables?
That is what we could do, truthfully, is we could only destroy the parent, and we could, in the association, do a dependent destroy. and that will do like, it'll chain the destruction, right? So it'll, what's that called in database terms? It'll like cascade delete or something. Yeah, yeah. So I can't remember exactly how to do that, but it's something like has many students, dependent destroy. Being a Rails programmer feels like being a Harry Potter wizard. I never remember any of the right spells. Well, in this case, let's see if I did. So now it should, when we destroy house, it should destroy the dependent children, the students. So let's see if we end up with still the same numbers, 50 and 5. Yeah.
What was it that you added?
I added over here dependent destroy so that it would cascade delete the associations. And so that's sometimes something you want, and it's sometimes something you don't want, right? Sometimes you wouldn't want the child of a association to be to sort of go away because you might want that orphan data just because you don't want to remove from your database. But often, if you're going to be removing the one of the many, you want the many to disappear as well. Is there any of these files that you need to see right now?
Maybe the seeds, because I'm getting an error.
Sure, here's the seeds file. Meanwhile, what I will do is I'm going to hop over down below here, back to my console, and I should be able to do some querying here, also to test out those associations. So I should be able to find a house and then find its students, or find a student and find the associated house. So I should be able to do something like student.first.house.name, and that should give me the name of the house of the first student. Except it doesn't because I need to reload. So in the Rails console, if you've recently made changes to your models, you always have to do reload ! For it to reload the models. Or you could just close the console and open it up again. And there you go. There is the name of the house of the first student. I could find that first student. So I could say student equals student.first. You could see the student is the Bloody Baron. And then I could do student.house or student.house to find its house. And it's sort of over there. Or student.house.name. So for any student, even the last one, I can chain to their associated house. So that's one way on my one-to-many association. I could also find any given house and find the collection of students that belongs to that house. So I could create a house variable and pull in the first house. There's our first house. And then I could go to house.students.count, and I should see that there's 10 students associated with that house. And I could also just look at all the students that belong to that house. That'll give me a collection of all of those students. Or I could find the students and then pluck out their names, and that'll give me an array of all the student names that belong to that particular house. The 10 students. So it looks like my associations are working. So I was able to use the associations to create the associated students, and I've also been able to retrieve houses and find their associated students, and retrieve a student and find its associated house. I'm curious if I can call .create on this and not have to separately save. So let's see if I can do that. back to the terminal, do a Rails DB seed. That looks like it worked. If I go and reload over here and pluck out my associated houses. Yeah, I didn't. Oh, maybe it's house.first.students.pluck name. Yeah, that did work. Rails programmers often are sort of very chain heavy, especially when working with active record. You often do things that sort of, there's quite a few chains to get things done. And this sort of cleans up my seed script a little bit more, so I don't need this temporary student variable any longer. There we go. So those are some of the steps that you will likely be working your way through when you first start your project. I mean, initially you're going to identify what kind of data you want to work with. Is it from an API? Is it from some kind of data set? Is it all going to be based on Faker? What is your schema going to look like? What are your associations? Are you going to have any one-to-manys, any one-to-ones? Are you going to have any join tables? Which is a relationship I haven't covered yet in this course, but we'll go over that in a later lecture. How to do has many throughs and belongs tos that sort of have a join table in the middle. But yeah, that sort of shows you the ins and outs of pulling some data into the tables and models that you create. In this case, all by way of Faker, but it could also be by way of a a CSV file or a JSON file. There are lots of helpful libraries in Ruby to work with data sets like XML or CSV or JSON, and to deserialize those bits of data into Ruby data types, so that you just pull in like the JSON library, and then you convert or parse the JSON, and it just turns into a hash of arrays or an array of hashes or whatever the structure is that you're inflating from JSON. I can show you a quick example of that because I've been working with, and again, I will save this whole project and I'll post it up to Learn right after class. But just to show you an example of pulling data in from a CSV, I can open up a separate project here, which is, where do I have it? So I'm on the organizing committee for the Red River College Directions Conference, and specifically I'm in charge of registration. And so they often ask me to pull reports for them, like how many students have registered and how many staff have registered and what sessions people are going to. And what I was having to do every time was like pull the data as an Excel file from Eventbrite and then use Excel to sort all of that data in some kind of way. And that was causing me some sort of, wasted time throughout the day. And so I thought, I'm a programmer, can't I just write a program to generate this report for me? And the answer is always yes. And so here, let's see if I can run this report. What do I have to do? Choose configuration. Okay, edit configuration. Why is it doing this when it never has before? Let me reopen this. Open directions. Once you have RubyMine opening a Rails project, we've opened a few things, right? I've opened up a terminal and a console, and it's just going to ask me to terminate some of those things. I guess it's forgotten my, what I want to run here. Oh, there we are. So there's the report. So I can see the number of students in total and students by campus and staff total, and also like the breakdown of who's registered for which sessions. All of that is coming from a CSV file. And so if we look at the CSV file, that is Ruby directions, CSV. Big long file, right? And it's got things like ticket type. So whether it's a staff ticket or a student ticket, it's got things like session selection, and it's sort of showing, you know, who picked what. So reporting on this was initially a pain, right? It was me in Excel doing all sorts of like filtering tables and formatting tables and whatnot. With Ruby though, it became much less of a pain. So what I did in Ruby was require CSV. That's just gonna pull in the CSV library. I passed to this report the name of the CSV I want to process. And so here I'm pulling that in from argv. Argv0 means just like the first command line argument. And so really it's as simple as doing a CSV read on argv. One of the things I didn't show you about Ruby object orientation is if you want to create a really simple object in Ruby, you can use this struct thing, and you could pass it a bunch of symbols, and it'll make a class for you with getters and setters that automatically exist for all those things. So struct.new attendee builds for me an attendee class. It's like a class factory. And so I get an attendee class that's going to have getters and setters for all of those things. And then what I'm going to do is I know that my CSV, that the very first row is a header. And so I can index the collection with a range, skipping the header. Yeah?
What about the type? Does it set the type in the tool? Or those are all strings?
Well, see, in Ruby, because things are dynamically typed, I don't have to specify. And so just at runtime, it'll just accept whatever. They're basically typed as object, capital O object. When I pass in a range, I can get back an array from that range. So here I'm saying, give me a range from 1 to -1. Negative numbers in Ruby arrays represent indexing from the other end of the array. So I'm basically saying, give me all of the rows except for the first one. So from 1 until the last row. And then I'm using the map command, which is a really awesome command that instead of looping over this data and creating a bunch of new attendees, what map does to a collection is you give it what you want to transform the data, and it's going to return to you a collection of the same size with each element in that collection transformed in a particular way. So I'm telling it to map the rows to attendees. And so I'm getting back an array of attendee objects where the ticket type is going to be row column 7, and the program is going to be row column 15. And sort of I know by looking at the CSV what these different columns are. So now I've got an array of attendees objects, and then I can use select. And so Ruby's got all these wonderful classes for working with collections. So if I want just all staff, I do attendees.select, and what attendee do I want to select? The one with a ticket type that equals Red River staff. And so basically that filters for me the array to a subarray that only includes staff. And I do that for all the possible ticket types. And then I sort of coalesce all the students back into one student array. You can use the plus operator in Ruby to add arrays together, and it just sort of, you know, appends those arrays to each other. So now I can figure out like how many students in total and the different subtypes of students just by calling their size. If you just want the count of the thing, so here I'm selecting a thing. If I just want to know how many records match, I could say like students.count, and then what students do I want to count? Well, I want to count the students where their campus is Notre Dame or their campus is Red Exchange District or other. So that gives me a quick way of counting records in a collection that match a particular thing. you know, in other programming languages, I would have to do a for loop for every single one of these things with temporary variables and like, you know, we get some of these in other languages. I know C# has these kind of collection methods, and Java's actually starting to get some of them in Java 9, I think. And here I am counting staff of different types. Here I'm doing some sort of like chaining. So this is what Ruby is sort of known for, is these sort of like chain-heavy operations. So I'm taking my student total, I'm grouping by the session 1 property. So that's going to give me back an array of arrays. And then I'm using that map operation to take every grouped thing and determine its size. So that's going to be like how many individual students picked each session. And then I'm going to sort by the size, so the data at position 1, because I want to get those ordered. So I want to know like the most enrolled session down to the least enrolled session. Sort by, I reverse it so I can get the most at the top, and then I turn it into a hash for displaying, and I do the same thing for session 2. And then I display all that information by looping through it down below. And that's how I get all of these session numbers down below. So I get the fact that the Young Entrepreneurs panel has got 111 people signed up for it, but Winnipeg's Bright Tomorrow has only 45, right? And that is how I was able to do some really quick reporting. In the past, it was taking me, you know, like 15, 20 minutes every time I had to manually build one of these reports. And it took me about 15, 20 minutes to write this script. So every time I run this script, I've saved myself another 15, 20 minutes. Oh, the joys of being a lazy programmer.
There
So,
was some story about a programmer in the US who built a program that will make him do his job and then deliberately make mistakes. So once he's got his code assembled, like the team he was working with, they would put out his mistakes, send it back, the program will fix it, and he was just doing whatever he wanted.
I like that idea. Right on. So there you go. So this is some of the fun stuff you can do with Ruby collections. In the past, I've actually given a whole separate lecture on all the possibilities of the Ruby collection class. If we have some time later on this term, I'll do the same, because this is just scratching the surface of all the different things. These are sort of you know, the collection operators, but there's also reduction operators, and so how to reduce collections of data down to you know, down to something. So like the simplest reduction would be to take an array of numbers and sum it, right? And again, that's something in other languages we would use a for loop for. In the Ruby programming language, you know, if I had numbers equals, you know, a bunch of different numbers here, and I wanted the sum, I would just say numbers dot reduce using the plus operator, and that would reduce the numbers using that operation for me. So again, just handy syntactic sugar in the Ruby programming language. And that's also an example of using the CSV to pull in easy data. So some of the data sources that I've linked to in some of those links provide CSV data. I think that's all I've got for you for today. Unless you have any other questions, please take some time outside of class to read over the project report that I posted to get some initial ideas over what you might want to work on for your project.